So your pointer is the top one, and then left and
Got
right.
it. Well, thank you so much for coming out, especially to hear about an insect, because I know that from working in Yellowstone, people do not even realize there are insects there. They're so captivated by bison and other large charismatic organisms. So I appreciate your attendance. With your indulgence, I'm going to kind of talk to you through the whole process of how the research went. And I'll explore with you some of the things that are unique about this insect, Cicindela haemorrhagica, the one I'm going to talk to you about. And as a bonus, I will tell you that after today's talk, you will actually know something about what is arguably one of the most unique insects on the planet in terms of its ability to withstand temperature and live in an unbelievably harsh environment. So the story starts back in 2006 when my former student, Bob Peterson, got tenured and promoted at Montana State. So one of my sons, Cameron, who was, I think, 13 here, he and I drove across and had a surprise as part of a surprise party for Bob. And then we came back through the north part of the park, and we stopped at Mammoth Hot Springs. And one of the things we looked at was Angel Terrace, which, if you know, is up one of the higher terrace, is part of the higher terrace area. That loop that drives around, you can see Angel Terrace there. And looking as an entomologist would, I noticed this beetle feeding on something in the thermal pool. And the thing about it was so wrong. These beetles are not supposed to be feeding in the water. They're not supposed to be feeding in areas where the water's hot. And I got incredibly excited, took pictures, and started investigating what the heck is going on with this, because it doesn't seem like we should be having insects here. And in fact, I'm not the guy who made the first discovery of this beetle. It was first reported in 1898. But for more than 100 years, that's all that happened. There was this report that these beetles occur in thermal areas, and nobody did any investigation. So about 8 years later, I was able to find a student, Kelly Williamsons, who started a PhD student who started our research in Yellowstone. And I did this in collaboration with Bob Peterson, the guy I went to see. So Bob and I worked together. But before I go into that, what are tiger beetles in the first place? So there are about, I think I should know this number, and I don't think I do. I started to say 3,500, but that doesn't sound right to me. There's something between 3,500 and 5,000 different species of tiger beetles around the world. And I dare say that if you know what you're looking for, you can probably see these in Cody, because there's a species that I call the sidewalk tiger beetle that uses sidewalks and pavement as its area to search for prey. They are about so big, whatever that is, a little bit over an inch. They come in lots of very colorful colors. That's kind of redundant there. You can see the eggs here. They have a unique larval stage where the larva burrows into the dirt, and then it sits on see if I get this to work. Whoa, let's go back. This is the larva sitting, waiting for food to come to it, and then it will, like a monster out of a science fiction film, rear out, grab it with its mandibles, and haul it into the burrow. I'm still fascinated by this because it seems to me one of the dumbest ways to try to make a living of any animal. Just waiting for your food to walk by. At least antlions make a pit so food falls in. I don't understand how these guys get by, but they're a very old lineage of beetles who've been extremely successful, so clearly they know something I don't. They usually form a pupal stage in the soil, and then they emerge, and either in the spring, in the case of this tiger beetle, the wet salts tiger beetle is his common name, they emerge in June and are active through most of the summer. Other tiger beetle species can be as active as now, late March, April, and usually they disappear around October. I can't talk about tiger beetles without talking about tiger beetle rodeo. One of the things that species do, now this might look like they're mating, but they're not. You can tell by looking back here that the male hasn't everted his genitalia. Actually, when the males mate with a female, they first have to get on top of her, and they use their mandibles to grab on. And the females, to test the males, are just like bucking broncos. They try to knock them off, and it's only the males that are successful hanging on that actually get to breed. And then not only do they do that, but then after they mate, they still won't leave because they figure, evolutionarily, that as long as they are there, other males can't be there. So it's a way of what's called mate guarding among tiger beetles. So these are common behaviors across all tiger beetle species, which I think is pretty cool. But let's talk about the Yellowstone wet salts tiger beetle. We formed a research team, and the names that are, I won't bore you with all the names, but the names they have stars are graduate students. We had 1 PhD student and 3 master's students who worked with Bob and I on this. We had really, I can't tell you how great the support was from the Park Service, and especially Eric Oberg, who was initially helped us with this. And I don't know if your other speakers have mentioned this to you, but it is insanely hard to get research permits at Yellowstone. It's the premier park, and for us, we didn't just need research permits, but we needed research permits that let us go into the thermal areas. And getting access to the thermal areas is very, very difficult. And it's intrinsically unsafe, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. One thing you can see, this boot is actually the end of the season. The soils at most of our sites were so acidic, it actually ended up eating the sole off the boot. Nevertheless, the other thing I would say about it, which isn't so great for seeing Kelly here trying to take pictures of beetles, is that it isn't widely advertised, but the thermal areas in Yellowstone are kind of like EPA Superfund sites. Those sites bring up a lot of heavy metals that are toxic. Our sites actually had arsenic levels above EPA limits, and they have mercury levels. And so that heavy metals are one of the things the beetles have to cope with if they're going to live in this environment. So that's something we actually looked at. Our main research sites, I keep hitting that, excuse me. One more, here we go. Our main research sites were up here at Mammoth Hot Springs at a spring called Angel Spring. Here in Norris Geyser Basin, and in Norris Geyser Basin we were at a spring called Dragon, which is about a half mile off the trail into the geyser basin, in an area that, in my opinion, is really unsafe to be at. And we took a lot of precautions working there. And then we found this wonderful site, Rabbit Creek, where it was only about 3/4 of a mile off the road. So it was easy access for us, and we could park there. And so a lot of our research was concentrated on the Dragon site or Rabbit Creek. But there's, as you can see, there's stars here indicating different locations. And in fact, most of the places we looked at, we could find beetles. It didn't matter whether the soil was acidic. In a few instances, you can see these pHs. There's a pH of 9.5, and some of them have very alkaline soils, some of them have very acidic soils, and all of them have heavy metals of different sorts. So actually, how did we do our research in here? Well, we did a couple of things. We had to assess the size of the beetle populations. We had to determine the life cycle of the beetle in the thermal areas. We had to look at the behavior of the beetle, and Kelly spent a lot of time monitoring beetle behavior, which I'll show you in a moment. And I would say that walking in those thermal areas, which, I mean, almost none of us ever have a chance to do that, is as close as you get to being on another planet. It's still active volcanically. As an example of this, our site at Angel Hot Springs this spring moved 30 feet in location within about a month period. So we were never really certain, and we had trails to go into the sites, but we were never really certain that thermal features hadn't moved in there. So we were using ski poles or hiking sticks to kind of test the soil surface to make sure we weren't going to break through. We had problems with bears. In fact, the very first time we were doing things at Angel, we got chased off the site because this immature black bear showed up, and so we didn't want to be around when its mom came. And then, of course, we could find grizzly tracks at a number of the other sites, particularly at Dragon. And I had always thought that we'd have more problems with bison than we would have with bears, but bears were around the sites. But I'm going to put a question to you. What was the animal that caused us the greatest problems in doing our research in Yellowstone? Humans is right, absolutely right. I can't tell you, it got so bad at some of the sites where people could see us working, is that we had to allocate another person just to prevent people from walking out into the thermal areas. It doesn't matter how much signage there is. I don't understand what it is with people that they won't believe the signs that these areas are dangerous, but they don't. And so, yeah, eventually we would always have a team of 3 or 4. Initially, it was a team of 3. 1 person on bear watch, 2 people to do the research. But then we would have a 4th person who was there just to deal with the public in areas where we were closer to the public, which was principally at Angel. Now, one of the things we were really curious about is this beetle, the wet salts tiger beetle, occurs in Yellowstone, but it occurs other places in the U.S. And it's not widespread. Sometimes it's associated with hot springs. We were interested in what the next nearest location was, and that was about 350 miles away in Idaho. And its location in Idaho, which you see here, is hot, but it's not a hot spring. It's just hot daily levels. So you'll see me talk about comparisons of Idaho with Yellowstone. And this is the Idaho site that I'm talking about. This was the reason that we did things. You can see from the video that these beetles are wandering all over this substrate. And we could record beetles wandering around at 140 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 3 minutes, 20 minutes at 122. And as a group, tiger beetles are all about avoiding heat. If you look at what's written in the literature with the other species, it's all about heat avoidance because they tend to be active during the hottest part of the days and they will overheat. And so we were astonished to see beetles just blithely going around at such high temperatures. It's not, as we said, it's not normal. Turns out it's normal for these beetles, but it's not normal for other beetles. This is an example of a normal behavior. This is the same beetle in Idaho, and you can see how it's up on its legs and it's kind of posturing around the sun. This behavior is called stilting, and it's a way to try to reduce the amount of sunlight that's hitting the beetle. Another thing they do, which you can see here, is they'll actually seek shade, and they'll stay in shade, and what they will do is run from the shade to sunny areas. They'll cool themselves off, then they'll run out in the sun looking for prey items, and then they'll come back and cool off. That's the typical pattern for most tiger beetles. Not so for this guy. They would readily stay out in the middle of the sun in very hot waters, making apparently little or no effort to thermoregulate. Not only that, but when we started looking, we found this, that within a few meters of the spring, maybe 6 feet, we would find larval tiger beetle burrows, which is a problem on 2 levels. First, I guess it's an advantage to the larvae that they're living in hot soils because the soils are hot, but what on earth are they eating? I can only guess that their diet has to be mostly ants. We didn't explicitly look at what larval tiger beetle diet was, but it seems to me that's the most likely thing that they would come across. And probably larval diet is the biggest limitation on their numbers. Although their numbers are robust, we would find 150, 200 beetles at a given location, and lots of locations, which is not a lot for an insect, but for these guys is pretty good. So our question was, well, I'll be blunt, how the hell are they alive? I mean, we couldn't figure out what was going on. We knew there must be something interesting because they're here in these very hot spots, but how are they living? And then when we realized on top of this, they're living in a heavy metal soup, how is it they're not poisoned by the heavy metals? So Kelly started by just recording behaviors. And there were lots and lots of days of her with close focusing binoculars recording behaviors. And this is what she came up with, which is really striking. Here on the left in Yellowstone, you can see that most of the time, about 20% of the time, they were actively trying to warm up. They weren't merely not trying to cool, they were trying to get hotter most of the time. They were engaged in behaviors, particularly in the morning, to try to heat up. Whereas the same species in Idaho, it acts like a normal tiger beetle. Most of their behavior is cooling behavior, and they spend a lot of time in the afternoons trying to cool. So it became clear to us that they have some sort of adaptation in Yellowstone to allow them not merely to survive heat, but actually to favor it. So now the story takes kind of a weird turn. One thing that we thought we should do was see if they were particularly tolerant to temperature. And so you can do this by what's called lethal temperature testing, where you put the insects in a water bath and you heat them up at a certain rate and see what temperature it takes for them to die. Now, the same time we decided to do this, I can set aside on a personal note, I started the series of really severe health effects. I was diagnosed in a 3-year period with bladder cancer, prostate cancer, and kidney cancer, which I'm happy to say all 3 are in remission, as hard as that is to believe, so good for me. But I mention it right now because because of the surgeries and everything radiation treatments, I was stuck at home. And so when we were doing this lethal temperature testing, which we did in the Bozeman lab, we set up Zoom cameras, and I remember I was in my pajamas there recovering from my surgeries, and they were doing the tests, and over Zoom they'd tell me the data, and I'd enter it in the computer and start doing the analysis. So it was a very weird sort of way to do research, but we made it work. And what did we find? Well, we found that they are incredibly tolerant of temperature. This chart shows that the average lethal temperature was 50 degrees C. In comparison, you can get the champions, which are little tardigrades, which you may be familiar with. They can tolerate insane temperatures. For most animals, people usually talk about Pompeii worms, which are these marine worms that live near volcanic vents in the deep ocean. They tolerate 70 degrees C, but their heads are actually in a cool water stream. So when it comes to sexually mature, sexually active insects, there are insects that can tolerate higher temperatures. There's this Cataglyphus bombycina, which are worker ants, but those worker ants are sterile, so they're not sterilized by the high heat. So the wet salts tiger beetle are really amazing that they can be sexually active and frankly not cook their sperm while they're doing that, which I think is astonishing.
Is that an LD50 or another?
It's an LD50. Good, that's a good question. And let me tell you, the park was not real thrilled with our doing that, because to get those numbers, you need to have a lot of individuals. So we were very fortunate that we spent our time doing those population estimates, so we were able to convince them that our taking the individuals we needed for the test wasn't going to impact the population, nor did it, actually, as we looked out. But one of the things that was striking to us is that there were some differences in location, as this shows. There was a big difference. Well, there was a difference of about 2 degrees with Idaho, But when we looked at tiger beetles generally, they're all really temperature tolerant. So the differences were, we had, I think our high, as I put up here, was 51, but even the species that weren't in thermal areas were at 49, 48, which is very, very high for an insect. Most insects will die at around 38, 39. I know this is kind of surprising. When you're out in the summer and it's in the 90s and you're being bothered by flies, you're thinking, well, Higley must have been a big fat liar because these flies aren't dying at 90 degrees. The reality is those flies can tolerate high temperatures for short periods of time, then they'll fly into the shade to cool off. So they use this behavioral thermal regulation to prevent their body temperatures becoming too severe. Now, the number one question, why would they do it? We have some evidence that actually supports this claim I'm going to make, but if you are if you spend time just looking at the waters there in the thermal areas, you will find dead insects. Lots of insects get caught in the steam or get distracted by the water and fly in there and are stunned and get killed. And we have seen tiger beetles foraging on those. And so although tiger beetles are predaceous, they're not above taking a free meal. And in fact, without going into a lot of the details, based upon our work looking at heavy metal concentration in prey species and comparing that to the tiger beetles, we found that probably 75% of tiger beetle diet is from insects that occur in the thermal pool ecosystem, but another 25% are just insects that fall into the water. So my thinking is that adapting to these high temperatures does two things. It gives them access to a resource that no other insects have, and it also helps protect them from predaceous insects because there aren't that many other insects that actually occur in the thermal areas. There are these small ephedrid flies, which are brine flies. If you've ever been to the ocean and seen flies on seaweed, it's the same group of insects. And their larvae actually occur in certain areas in the thermal pools, and the wet salts tiger beetle will feed on those. There are also some other flies. This is a larva of a fly called a stratiomyid that occur there. There are also some small shore bugs, and all of those are potential prey items for wet salts tiger beetle. So I mentioned that we did work on heavy metal toxins. To do the analysis for heavy metals, you actually have to take the insect, put it in a witch's brew of acids, and dissolve all of the tissue of the insect, and then you run it through a GC mass spec, which they had. And when I was showing this before, someone commented on the Instrapot. Let me tell you that we learned how to make a dollar scream. Rather than spend $4,000 or $5,000 on a water bath, which we were going to ruin when we put all this acid in it, we figured we could do just as well with an Instapot. When we were doing our lethal temperature studies, I don't know if you know what sous vide is, the cooking technique where you get water at the same thing. Well, we got a sous vide water heater, and we actually put that in a tank, and we realized that we could ramp up the temperatures for doing our temperature study, and so we spent a couple $100 on those, again, as opposed to $4,000 or $5,000 on a research quality water bath. So we looked at the heavy metals, and just as one example, we found exactly sort of textbook biomagnification. There's mercury in the water, mercury in the soil, mercury in the algal mats, mercury in larvae that tiger beetles would feed on, higher levels of mercury in the beetle. And then there's a published paper that somebody found a killdeer feather in one of the thermal areas, and it is way higher mercury concentration as well. So for mercury, and even, I don't show the data here, but we saw the same sort of thing with arsenic, which is interesting because people tell me arsenic is not supposed to bioaccumulate, but it bioaccumulates in the beetles. So the question becomes, Where does it go? And I don't expect you, this is one of those, let me tell you what this is. This is one of those things to make me feel good. I don't expect anybody to look at all these charts and know what it means. It's just a background to say, yeah, I really did what I'm telling you, and you can see if you look at these charts. Basically, we looked at a bunch of different heavy metals, and we dissected beetles to see if the beetles were actually storing metals in their tissue. And they were. One of the places they store heavy metals is in their mandibles. And it's widely thought that when beetles do this, and there's other species that do, it's a way to help strengthen the mandibles. We also found that they put a lot of heavy metals into their exoskeleton, particularly the ventral part on their abdomen. And here in just a minute, that's going to become maybe important, maybe not, but certainly suggestive. So we had this information about their ability to withstand high temperature, but we knew that they were experiencing temperatures higher than their lethal temperatures, so we still had the question of what they were doing to survive. And you can see, for example, there were beetles that would occur as high as 65 C, and they're wandering around there. So this just reinforces the fact that the beetles weren't caring too much. So we were still curious about what's going on. And I had seen this with one other tiger beetle species, but it occurs with wet salt's tiger beetle. And so I'm going to ask you to use either your imagination or really good eyesight. But can you see this thing right there? That's a water droplet. And it's a water droplet being held on the other side of the abdomen. And just like, you know, how I said that, what the hell's going on, how are they surviving? We have the same response to this. There's no way that they should be able to hold a water droplet because they're massively coated in wax to prevent drying out in these really dry environments. So they should be completely water repellent. And so we couldn't figure out how it was they were holding a droplet of water when we knew from testing that they were covered with these what are called cuticular waxes. So one of my students, Willa Torin, looked at hairs on the underside of the abdomen, and you see these little grooves in the hair? These grooves, now I'm telling you super patent level secrets. These grooves are about 1 micron in diameter and about half a micron deep. And we did some experiments trying to reproduce the grooves. And what we discovered was that if you have grooves at just this size range, it actually changes a substance that ordinarily repels water into one that will attract water. And so Corey mentioned my patent. That was our patent. That sort of inspired by the beetles, we've discovered that there's this phenomenon. I think it's the first time it's been recorded in nature. The physicists call it hemiwicking. And even though I wrote part of the patent, I'm fully prepared to say I understand almost none of it. I push myself right to the limits of my abilities in terms of doing this thing. But it certainly is true. And I can show you an example. If you look here on your left, I'll just play the video. These are squares that have been patented with grooves of different sizes. And can you see how he tips the plate? Certain of those grooves, which the whole plate should be water repellent, actually will hold water. So if any of you have ideas how I can make millions of dollars from this, I would be happy to entertain your suggestions. I can tell you I would never earn millions of dollars. The University of Nebraska and the University of Montana might. It wouldn't be Bob and I. But we have had conversations with different companies, and we're kind of interested in seeing if we can find commercial uses for this. But whether we do or not, it's a very cool phenomenon. And it's one of the ways they're heating these droplets around, and then they get evaporative cooling. What about the internal temperatures? This was work that was done in Bob's lab by a master's student, John Boley. And John did just this great job where he would wire up beetles, hold them above a water bath, and we could measure the internal temperatures. And so you kind of see the setup here, our sous vide water bath with a beetle just above the water. And what he discovered was the temperatures of Yellowstone beetles were always colder than the temperatures of Idaho beetles by 2 degrees at least. And all of the experimental conditions are the same. Supposedly they're the same species. So again, what's going on? John did some more sophisticated stuff, and there we go. And you could actually see that the beetles in Yellowstone, which is in blue, are, oh, darn it, I wish I would quit hitting that. There we go. Are actually reflecting higher levels of near-infrared radiation, in other words, heat. And so there's something about their physical structure that reflects heat. And my thinking is maybe it has to do with those heavy metals. Maybe there's something about a matrix in the heavy metals that actually allows the beetles to reflect infrared radiation, which would also be cool and maybe another patent, except that we're stuck right there. To go any further, we need to do some transmission electron microscopy, which we may be able to do in the coming year or may not. It's not entirely clear. I was asked the question before the talk about where the research stands, and right now it stands without any funding is where it stands, the lament of every scientist. So we're still doing what we can, but it's exciting. So you get the idea of the beetles. They tolerate high temperatures. If they get really hot, they can suddenly start their own air conditioning with these droplets. And they are reflecting infrared radiation. They also just naturally hold themselves up off the substrate because the substrate, a couple millimeters at the surface, is really hot. So there's one other sort of closing point I want to make, and that has to do with how did these beetles become so adapted? And that's a mystery too. For those of you out there might be more knowledgeable about this than I am, but it's my understanding that 20 to 13,000 years ago, the park was covered by a glacier, and that glacier disappeared around 13,000 years ago. So the earliest time the beetles could have actually been in the park would be 13,000 years. They have a 1 to 2 year life cycle, so that's only 13,000 generations at the most that they could have been separated from the Idaho population. So another really important question is, what did the genetics of those two beetle populations look like? And unfortunately, I can't answer that question, again, because of funding, but it's on our list of things we really need to do. And we could very well be seeing an example where that species of tiger beetles is now its own subspecies or potentially its own species as it's adapted to live in these high temperature areas of Yellowstone. So just to finish up, it's not very, it may have been known for 100 years. I'm sure thousands, maybe millions of people have actually seen them and not known what they were. But in terms of animals that are adapted to harsh environments, this wet salts tiger beetle has to be one of the absolute champions, the most unique in the world. And I think it illustrates a really good point about what's great about Yellowstone. Having the opportunity to look at species in Yellowstone, which has such a diversity of habitats, including such harsh habitats as the thermal areas, there's no telling what you're going to find. You just need to look. And I think that's what the ultimate message is from our research. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, ma'am.